Hello, everyone, and welcome back for this next session. We're going to have a fascinating conversation between New York Times London bureau chief Mark Landler and Andrew Steer, President and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund. Please join me in welcoming our speakers on stage.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Landler, and I apologize for not being on stage with Andrew this morning. I was unfortunately forced to come back to London for other news. But anyway, I'm delighted to be part of this session. Andrew has a train to catch himself, so we're going to keep this extremely brisk and efficient and try to get him on his way back to London as well. But it's really a pleasure to have him here because he's as president of the Bezos Earth Fund, probably one of the most closely watched figures outside of the world of government and policy making in the climate sphere. And so I want to talk about the Bezos Fund, but before I get to that, Andrew, I just did want to ask you a few questions. We're now within 36 hours of the end of COP26. And I just wonder whether you'd give us your status report. What's gone well and what hasn't gone well so far?
Great. Well, look, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Sophie, too. And before answering that question, let me commend you at the New York Times for truly remarkable programming here. I mean, exceedingly good. It's also astonishingly beautiful in this building. We're surrounded by trees, but thank you. It's an honor to be here. Look, we live in a sort of cognitive dissonance at the moment. On the one hand, if you actually look at the pledges that were made last week by the non-governmental sector, and if you look at the longer-term plans of government, you actually see that we have reached an inflection point. You actually see that for the first time ever, we are accelerating the kind of action that is needed. And if you add all those commitments together, we're sort of round about 2 degrees we're heading for. Not good enough, but much better than has ever been the case before. Then, of course, if you look at what countries are committing to in their NDCs, not their long-term commitments to net zero, but their NDCs, it's profoundly disappointing. We're heading in a decade when we need to lower carbon emissions by 45%. We're leading to a decade where they're actually going to rise by about 10 to 15%. So obviously we're heading in the wrong direction. And that's why, as often happens in COPs, you have this rhythm that happens where in the first week when heads of state are here, they go the extra mile, CEOs are here, they go the extra mile. Financial institutions this year went astonishingly in the right direction. And you reach the end of the first week exhausted but feeling, my goodness me, we're really onto something new here. Go into the second week where the negotiators take over and all of the inertias, all of the politics come back onto the table. And you've got a situation now where governments around the world are getting sort of mixed messages because, Mark, I know you've written about and you've spoken about sort of the two COPs, if you like. They're the negotiators who now are staying up all night, especially in week 2. And then you've got the parallel COP where you've got the non-governmental private sector making all kinds of commitments, but then you've got young people on the street angry. So you've got these governments around the world getting messages on the one hand from the financial sector saying, for heaven's sake, we're now on the march. Angry young people saying this is a total failed COP. So all still to play for in the next 24 hours.
Well, let me ask you, Andrew, why don't we zero in on that parallel COP for a moment? I'm wondering whether you saw things this past 10 days that particularly encouraged you or discouraged you, whether we're talking about climate finance, whether we're talking about innovation, And also, honestly, the extent to which the private sector as well as government were prodded by the young people marching outside the building. What's your sense of how well that parallel COP did? Let's leave aside the official COP for a moment.
Well, the parallel COP, in my judgment, was much better than anticipated. I think, some true notable standouts. Financial sector has done something that's never been done before. It said, $130 trillion of assets under management will become, net zero by the middle of the century. Now, what does that mean? It means if you're the CEO of Bank of America, by 2050, the tens of thousands of loans you've got out there, investments you've got out there with the private sector, those have to, on average, themselves, those companies, need to be net zero. So you better start thinking about how you're going to move that whole giant ship around from currently a massively carbon-intensive portfolio in many banks and asset management funds now towards that. So talking with some CEOs of large banks, they said, we've got to start making phone calls. We've got to start asking, okay, ExxonMobil, if you want to be our client, you don't need to stop producing oil today, but you need to have a plan to become net zero. So this is a remarkable thing, and I think we haven't yet really thought about the extent to which this will in turn prod the private sector to step up its game. So whether you believe the 130 trillion or not, even if it was half that amount, it's actually something dramatically symbolic. And I live in the United States at the moment. A year ago, show me a large American bank that was committed to net zero. You'll have a lot of them giving speeches, but none of the major ones are really committed. Now, basically, they all are. Even Goldman Sachs was the last to come on board about 2 weeks ago. I regard that as something extremely positive. And the question is, why are they doing it? Partly because, as you say, Mark, there are pressures coming from, if you like, protesters who, remember, are the future clients of these very financial institutions. These students themselves need banking accounts, so my goodness me, we better present ourselves. So we're having pressures on the financial sector, and obviously you've also got asset owners who are starting to get much more serious. So I regard the financial sector commitments as important. The second major contribution, I think, was putting nature on the agenda. We've never had that before. So we've always known that if you want to address climate change, you've got to worry about the carbon in nature. But never before have we had the kind of remarkable commitments that were made, financial commitments to nature, but also actually commitments on the private sector to nature. And interestingly, Mark, this what you call the parallel COP last week included governments. So governments were making all kinds of commitments last week to zero deforestation. Those are not yet fully embedded in their NDCs, funnily enough. So you actually have a tale of two governments as well, whereby governments are committing to things, and I think they meant it. Of course, they promised zero deforestation before, but I think most expert observers regard this time as a little more serious. Why? Because the private sector and the purchasers and the trade systems themselves are wanting to see some progress. So all good, and an interesting question is, why in the light of that are the young people and those that are protesting so totally unimpressed? And I think there's a pretty major problem that has not been addressed, which is a conversation that is actually, grown up between the corporates, the financial sector, and governments together with their citizens. But I would credit the protesters greatly. I think they've played an extremely positive and helpful role. I just hope I hope the chasm doesn't widen so that, if a year from now we're still, everyone's saying on the streets it's all blah, 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 and the corporates and governments are actually starting to make some progress, I mean, you could see a real disillusionment on the part of the actors, the financiers, the corporates, and even the governments. So I really hope we can find a way of engaging a more genuine conversation.
Just before we switch to the Earth Fund, I did want to ask you just for a quick reaction to the news yesterday from the United States and China, which I think did surprise people. People knew John Kerry was meeting a lot of people. I'm not sure they necessarily thought he'd come out with that announcement. What did you make of it?
Well, I'd give positive. And certainly I'd give John Kerry a great deal of credit for many nights, and also the Chinese delegation for, being open to having that conversation. So net positive, not enough, I mean, obviously, but at least it does indicate that it is perhaps possible to have a climate track that is a positive track that is a little bit insulated from all of the other politics.
I want to now switch to the Bezos Fund. This is a fund that under Jeff Bezos's direction has pledged to give away $10 billion over the next decade. You've already committed about $3 billion, I guess, by my count, to broadly speaking, nature, food production, land restoration. As you make these decisions, why did you choose these three priorities as your first three big ones? I know you're doing a lot of things in the area of climate justice and other things as well, but what led you to identify these three as your first big ticket priorities?
Well, we saw that, as we build up our own capacity, we certainly don't want to spread ourselves too wide too soon. We felt that because nature was rising on the agenda, and because of the confluence of both this COP26 and the biodiversity COP, which main discussions will take place next April in Kunming, and because there is a real possibility of what is called 30 by 30, 30% of land and sea to be conserved by 2030, we thought that we could play a helpful role in advancing the political as well as the substantive momentum here. And so at the time of the UN General Assembly, we announced $1 billion for conservation. And last week here, we announced another $2 billion. So conservation, restoration, and food system transformation. Those three things, they all work together. And if the world is able to reverse course on deforestation, to start, if you like, restoring the 2 billion hectares of the world that are actually now seriously degraded, that's twice the size of China, and very importantly, start really transforming the way we think about food. In the next 30 years, we will need food production growth greater than we've had in the last 50 years for the world as a whole. And at a time when no longer can we enjoy the sources of growth that we've had so far. So the sources of growth have been more land, expand into forests, destroy nature in order to produce food. That option has gone. And at the same time, the idea of massive increases, say, in irrigated agriculture are no longer really available. Why? Because water is going to become much less predictable. And so too, the sort of chemical intensive agriculture has got. So you've got this sort of fascinating situation where you've got to actually increase food production at a rate more rapid than before, at a time when it's going to be more difficult. So, we need a new type of agriculture. We need to shift diets towards more plant-based. We've got to reduce the 1/3 of all food that is lost and wasted before it even reaches the human mouth, sort of thing. So that's why we picked those themes. But running through this, as you say, Mark, the theme of social justice and the theme of poverty reduction, rate very high. But I think Sophie's coming to tell us that we've gone on too long.
No, I mean, I want to keep you company because you by yourself here, though you're surrounded by those beautiful trees. But we were trying, Mark, to include a few questions from the audience, and as Andrew has to leave. So I'm going to take 3 questions in a row. If you can be quick and short and succinct in your question, that would be great.
I'll stand up. Bonjour, my name's Ashley Fairbanks. I'm from the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, and I mean this very respectfully, Andrew, but $10 billion is 5% of Jeff Bezos' total net worth, from one of the biggest pushers of consumerism and one of the most destructive forces in global capitalism. So what do you see as your moral imperative to push him to personally divest himself of more of his wealth? Because for me, the equivalent would be me pledging to give $500 towards global climate change. So how do you reconcile that?
Thank you for that question. Another one, please.
Thank you, and I wonder as well, what's your vision for those new agricultural systems rather than just going, like reconciling the good things that work in the past rather than trying to reinvent the wheel each time? Thank you, I'm Johanna Suleta.
Thank you, Joanna. And the one behind Fiona. No, not, sorry, just here. The lady, okay. We can't hear you.
Hello. Hi. Dr. Steele, hi. I'm Dan Cunningham from Corso. We're a startup transforming how retail makes decisions. I'm interested in how much potential do you see in kind of being able to quantify and understand the value of nature, and how much appetite do you see from big companies to get involved with that?
Great, thank you. So Mark, I'll hand over to you to manage those 3 questions.
Well, for the first question, thanks for asking it. Look, you know, for me, having the privilege of managing a fund of $10 billion is a great honor, and we need to spend it just extremely well. I mean, this month we're going to be making $130 million of grants to indigenous groups in the United States and BIPOC groups led by people of color to address the shocking crisis of environmental justice. So I'm getting on as well as I can with my job, and I would love to talk to you about that. On the food system, I mean, yeah, I do believe there's some incredible sort of new opportunities that are out there. We don't need to do what we've done before. I think we now have a pretty good idea what needs to be done, but it's not being scaled up. And one of the things that what philanthropy can do is because it can move quickly, it can move boldly, and in our case, we've got some serious financial resources. We have to ask the question all the time, how by placing resources in at the right time in the right way can we, if you like, open up, bring in other resources so that in the case of where there are new techniques that, you know, farmers get it gets linked into agricultural supply chains. We now know how to monitor deforestation-free commodities, for example. We now have technology. We're investing in satellite technology that will enable to see by 10 meters by 10 meters everywhere on the Earth's surface, trees falling and trees regrowing in a very remarkable way, and to know how much carbon is embedded in them. So we now are at a stage where we can start monitoring. And so what our job is to inject funds in a way that a new technology, which we may have supported, by the way, with investing in agricultural research, can go much quicker from the laboratory to the farm, if you like. And on the point about, you know, to what extent can we expect food companies and commodity companies to start valuing nature, I think that is a big exam question moving forward. There's no reason why we couldn't make progress on that. You could envisage some pretty exciting developments whereby we can start, if you like, valuing all of the things that are not valued. And I regard that as a great challenge, which we would like to be part of and would love to talk to you about that.
Mark, do you want to take the hand?
I'll ask one question. I almost didn't have the heart to ask this after hearing the question you got on Mr. Bezos's wealth, but I think it is on the minds of a number of people. there is this, critique that a few have made that while what he's doing is extremely in terms of all this finance for climate change. He also, recently financed a trip into orbit on a private space vehicle, and he's obviously not the only billionaire that's done this. But I just wonder, would you discourage him from doing a return trip, or was there a valid scientific reason for him to undertake that mission?
Oh, look, I think we need to explore on land and we need to explore in the space. I mean, how great that he and others have said, when you see the beauty and the fragility of Earth from space, it does change the way you think about things. So, no, I think it's great. Let me just say that it's very easy to sort of fall into oversimplifications. I saw somebody writing that, my goodness me, think of all that carbon pollution as the rocket goes up to space. Well, actually, rockets use hydrogen and oxygen. The only thing that comes out the back of a rocket is actually water vapor. So I do think we need to sort of bring facts to the table. But no, I believe we need to explore, and we need to, I think it's just a privilege to be, to manage these resources in the Earth Fund.
Right. Sophie, do we have time for one or two more questions? I mean, we want Andrew to be on his way by 10:50, but that gives us about 5 minutes by my count.
Yes. So let's take a quick round. The person there, if you can be succinct.
Yes, thank you for being here today. For Andrew, I was wondering if you could comment on, given the need for resources and the lack of time we have, is there coordination, say, between the Earth Fund and the other major philanthropic or billionaire funds, Eric Schmidt's Into Ocean, you know who they are, and Mark, if there's anything you could say about the important role of the media, or how it has to evolve moving forward.
Mark, in fact, we really need to close because I think Andrew needs to go. So maybe a quick answer,
Yes,
Andrew.
that's a terrific question. The answer is yes. I believe that we need to see teamwork. Leading up to the United Nations General Assembly this year, we got together with 8 other philanthropies, and together we were able to put $5 billion on the table for this 30 by 30, 30% of land and sea. And once you're able to sort of act, if you like, in unison, and now we're actually discussing working together in the Congo Basin, which is an extremely hard place to work. But actually, if you do it together, you're then able to engage at a senior level with government and so on. And then we're working now with some governments, the Germans, the Norwegians, the British, and others, to work together on the Congo Basin, for example. So yes, it's an excellent question. We need to do much more of that. And we need to not be thinking about flying our own flag. We need to be thinking about, getting up on a Monday morning and focusing on what on earth do we need to do. And if it's helping the Congo Basin countries, that's hard work. So forget about our own branding and focus on the issue in hand.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to have the last word?
I just wanted to say to the questioner on the media's role, we did a panel on this a couple of days ago, and I think it might be available on the website where I did address that question. So please take a look at that. And look, Andrew, thank you so much. It was a terrific conversation, even if somewhat abbreviated. And I think we will have you safely on your way, but it was one. And we will eagerly watch the work of the Earth Fund in the coming years.
Thank you, Mark.
Many thanks.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Mark.
you all.
Thank you, everyone.